Greetings and welcome to episode 1 of Unpacking Islamophobia, a podcast project brought to you by The.Bridge.Initiative at Georgetown University. My name is Arsalan Iftikhar. I am a senior fellow at The.Bridge.Initiative. I am the founder of themuslimguy.com and author of the book Fear of a Muslim Planet, Global Islamophobia in the New World Order. And I am thrilled beyond belief to welcome our first guest, Professor John Esposito from Georgetown University. Dr. Esposito is the founding director of the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Understanding at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and he is the author of over 45 books and monographs, including The Future of Islam, Islamophobia, and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, and Who Speaks for Islam, What a Billion Muslims Really Think. Dr. Esposito, I want to welcome you to our podcast here today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
So the International Herald Tribune once called you the most influential Islamic scholar in the United States. And my first question to you today is about the phenomenon of Islamophobia, which we both know is a hot button phrase that both means everything and nothing to a lot of people, and more importantly has evolved over the last several decades. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on how Islamophobia has evolved or devolved over the last few decades in your experience in the decades of work that you've been doing.
Well, sadly, it's been very complicated and it's grown significantly. I think it's important to note that prior to the Iranian Revolution, for the vast majority, certainly of Americans, but this is true in many parts of Europe, very little in general was known about Islam and Muslims in terms of education, in terms of training of diplomats, in terms of media coverage. Professional organizations like the Middle East Studies Association or the American Academy of Religion, both of which years later I was fortunate enough to become president of, had minimal coverage of any of that. And so when the Iranian Revolution hit, and hit at a time when obviously, you had TV and you could see things live, that was for many their first engagement with Muslims. I mean, they may have known somebody who was Egyptian or Arab or Lebanese or, in passing, but to actually have a sense of Muslims and their faith being raised in this overthrow where what was seen as a mighty Shah who had the second largest military in the Middle East, enormously wealthy, etc. On media, he and his wife in American media regularly when they would come here, speaking very flawless English, was suddenly overthrown by a revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini, a very senior cleric in his 70s who had been living outside the country for 22 years. And suddenly Iran was replaced by the Islamic Republic. That was complicated then with the American hostages. And all of this occurring at a time when in the media you would see every day demonstrations in the street of Tehran. And for many, again, they'd see a large demonstration and think that this was happening all over Iran, and that this, that all of these people represented what they were seeing, cries of death to America, or America being referred to as the Great Satan, then the taking of the American hostages held for more than a year. All of those things significantly, on the one hand, made policymakers and others interested, but it was more getting interested in, as it were, knowing the enemy. Now, post-Iran, you had another situation developing. The initial success and example in the toppling of an entrenched government of the Shah was heralded by many in the Muslim world as something positive. That is, it was, an authoritarian regime that had fallen, or a regime that was seen as un-Islamic. That was followed shortly after by the Afghan Mujahideen's success in ending the Soviet Union's occupation and driving them out of Afghanistan. The Mujahideen being seen as it were, holy warriors, and being celebrated. What they were doing was being celebrated and supported by the US, the UK, some of the Gulf states, and people are coming from various Muslim countries to also help in that fight. So the overthrow of the Shah and the Mujahideen victory became an example and a motivator for the growth of actually two things. One, the growth of both mainstream Islamic movements, but also of militant movements that would seek or wish to do this, to do the same thing. Now, the next wave becomes 9/11, and that was in many ways, equally stunning, even more shocking, certainly to Americans. For the first time, we were significantly attacked on our mainland. Both D.C. and at the World Trade Center, and then in D.C. the Pentagon. So with 9/11, Islamophobia began to grow exponentially. Al Qaeda's attack, Bush and Blair declaring a global war on terrorism, not just a focused war, let's say on Afghanistan or whatever, but a global war on terrorism. All of this framed, if you will, a globalized and a global confrontation. And indeed, you began to see the globalization of Islamophobia in a variety of ways. Mass arrests or gatherings of thousands of people of a Muslim background brought in. Some studies show 65 to 70,000 people being brought in, questioned, etc., and then let go. Arrests taking place, security at airports becoming very tough, and that security often not simply vetting, if you will, terrorists that could be easily identified, but in fact to be Muslim for many years, meant that you were watched very closely, often vetted more than once. So you were, as it were, if you were the average Muslim traveling, you were guilty until proven innocent. And that wasn't just in the U.S. That became global in terms of the way in which one saw it. At that time, I had appeared on Fox for an interview, and it was right after an interview that Bush had given with the head, with a senior military next to him, the head of the CIA, talking about the global war. And when I got on, I started to answer the question in a nuanced way in terms of this notion of a global war on terrorism. And the person who was interviewing me, the young woman said to me, "Are you deaf? Normally, you don't have that kind of discourse going on." I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Didn't you hear them say this is a global war on terrorism? That means the United States will and can go any place in the world." And so that set us, it seemed to me, in a new direction.
It did, and I really want to focus on the global nature of everything in the second question, and I actually want to preface it with actually an interesting story. So my latest book, as mentioned, is called Fear of a Muslim Planet: Global Islamophobia in the New World Order. But the original subtitle actually did not have the word global in it, actually, until you read my manuscript. You are one of the back cover endorsement quotes for the book. And I remember when you gave me a copy of my transcript back, my manuscript back for the endorsement, you said, I have a suggestion: add global to that subtitle. And it really resonated with me, and obviously it made it to the final print. And it's really important, as you said, Dr. Esposito, because many people often conflate Islamophobia with being a purely American phenomenon, right? Whether it's the Republican Party or Donald Trump, etc. But as we can see all over the world, from the rise of right-wing ethno-nationalism across the European Union that are based on anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant political platforms, to genocidal anti-Muslim ethnic cleansing campaigns in many parts of Asia, in places like China and Myanmar, and now in India. We're starting to see this rise of global Islamophobia in a way, metastasizing all over the world, which is quite worrying to obviously 2 billion Muslims living in the world today. So my question to you is, why do you think it's important to study Islamophobia as a global phenomenon? And how do you think that can really widen people's apertures in terms of the overall effect and impact that Islamophobia has on people all over the world?
Yes, well, I think that because it is because it is global, if you will, it becomes exponentially more important to always contextualize when people are talking about Islamophobia that it is a global phenomenon. I mean, think about the fact that, you know, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we're concerned about anti-Semitism globally. We don't just say, well, anti-Semitism in the United States and, you know, forget about the rest. And what becomes a really phenomenal situation is the extent to which it's become a wave that continues to go. And it's in becoming more and more global. You know, initially you're talking about the US and Europe, but then you see it spreading. Okay, so just a couple of points. What we see is a metastasizing social cancer, from my point of view, over a period now of decades, which impacts the lives of innocent Muslims globally, wherever it occurs. It's not just obviously that innocent people, whether Muslim or not, become victims, and it's not just that the terrorists are the Muslims that are caught and punished, etc., and have, you know, getting what they deserve, but that in fact very often, and you see it in polling over the years, that you wind up with significant percentage of a population that is non-Muslim, increasingly because of the actions of a fraction of the 2 billion Muslims in the world, generalizing and about Islam, and therefore nervous about having a Muslim as a neighbor, and nervous about being in a train or a plane with them, even complaining at times, Muslims being taken off the plane because of complaints. And so what we see then is discrimination, hate speech, hate crimes, violence, death. We see issues that have to do with safety, social and political acceptance in terms of mainstream Muslims, civil liberties, their security. Innocent Muslims, they become victims too often. And that can lead, as it has at times in and continues in a number of countries, lead to political policies, government and political policies and legislation that feed rather than ameliorate religious and ethnic racism. So Islamophobia has grown exponentially and globally over the decades. And there's a silence that takes place often on behalf of people who are going through this. That is, a number of governments don't speak out on it unless it's at home and it's very, very obvious. And with that, it also increased and legitimated an overwhelmingly negative media, whether it's print or social media. And we find phenomenal, you know, growth from an early period where you might see 1% or 2% of media coverage dealing with extremism, jumping to 28%, and where you would see the coverage of mainstream Muslims remaining, you know, the positive coverage, actually, the realistic coverage, remaining very minimal in terms of the amount of coverage out there. So that people reading their newspaper, people looking at television, people looking at movies, you know, who are the bad people in movies? You know, they generally are Muslim or are seen as Muslim. Now, more recently, up in, you know, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, we could see in the West, certainly in the US and Europe, and it's actually increased in some European countries, where Islam and Muslims wind up hitting at an all-time high globally in terms of the way they are seen and covered. Okay, so domestic and international terrorist attacks like AQ and ISIL, and then you have mass and social media and the way they cover. Then you have the way politicians handle it. The American presidential elections, you know, when President Trump talked in overwhelming numbers about the threat, and when asked for a number, he couldn't actually give a number, but it was overwhelming. He talked about that they would entertain monitoring mosques. He talked about putting a restriction on the number of Muslims who could come into the country, and it was one of the first things that he did. This kind of stuff, these serve as catalysts in the growth of Islamophobia. And so what you wind up with then is that fear of Islam and Muslims, not just militant extremists and terrorists, but fear of mainstream Islam. In fact, Islam is not seen as, if you will, mainstream, and Muslims has become normalized in popular culture, not only, and we'll talk about this, in America and in Europe, but actually increasingly in other parts of the world. And so in recent years, then, that globalization can be seen significantly in Europe, growing and existing in countries that don't have that many Muslims. Norway, Sweden,
even in Hungary with Viktor Orban,
Hungary, which has almost none, and in Poland. I did a conference in Poland, and I remember the person from Poland saying, "There's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we don't have many Muslims. The bad news is we have Islamophobia." But then you see that movement into Asia, and that makes for, it seems to me, a very clear situation of its growth, because in a couple of these instances, they've been labeled as genocide.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about all of this. And one thing I kind of want to flesh out a little bit more with you, is, since this is called 5 Islamophobia Questions with Professor John Esposito, is really comparing and contrasting conservative versus liberal Islamophobia. Another misconception that people often have is that Islamophobia is purely a quote-unquote conservative political phenomenon. But you and I both know that liberal Islamophobia is alive and well all over the world. We see hyper-secularists in France who try to ban the Muslim hijab, the headscarf, or have burkini bans on their coastal French towns, to even once Hillary Clinton's campaign, once infamously leaking a photo of then candidate Barack Obama in a traditional white Kenyan ceremonial outfit, which the Clinton campaign had leaked to the Drudge Report to drum anti-Muslim sentiment. So what I want to really ask you is, what do you see as some of the similarities and differences between conservative and liberal Islamophobia around the world today?
Yeah, one of the things I would note is that, that shows that the crossover at times in terms of the conservative and the liberal, and the concern of politicians, is that Obama did not go to a mosque until the very end of his second term.
Yep.
And that was, phenomenal when you really think of it. He went to a mosque overseas, in Turkey and in Egypt, but not in America. When you look at the conservative and liberal situation, one needs to think about the fact that today we're talking about the US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Holland, Poland, Hungary, then the Northern European countries, as I said, which have varied populations of Muslims, as well as in Australia, and in a number of cases, a very small number. And yet, Islamophobia has grown. France and Austria in particular, in the last year or two, you can't tell the difference when you look at the political parties, for example, in the last elections in France, in terms of their position with regard to Muslims, and the sense as almost an acceptance by the current government of Le Pen's line that to be Muslim means that your sole identity is so French that it's simply that French is your language, your culture, your food, your etc. That kind of mentality. And I think pretty close to that also in Austria, with the kinds of raids that took place in Austria at one point, with something like 900 security people. So all of that is very much out there. And then more recently, you see the global phenomenon of China with the Uyghurs, over 1 million Uyghurs, Myanmar/Burma and the Rohingya. Again, you're talking about 1 million. India, you could be talking as potential victims in India. One forgets you have something like 200 million Muslims living there. And then the situation also in Kashmir and in Sri Lanka. So this latter part has really come to be noticed. It's been there, but developed and come to be noticed very much in the last 5 years in particular. And it has gotten very nasty in terms of the isolation of Muslims, the detention of Muslims, the attempt to eradicate Muslims. You think about with the Rohingya having to deal with having lived for generations in Myanmar, having their villages burned down, their women raped. We have a video that my class can see in which you wind up hearing and talking about and seeing the kinds of ways in which people were totally terrorized and driven out. And more recently, we see the kinds of actions that are now taking place in India as the current government actually represents a government that wants to basically declare at the end of the day the so-called secular democracy of India as a Hindu nation. And the approach very much is that Muslims were the problem in the past and that Muslims should all go to Pakistan. And then the kinds of ways in which people are discriminated against in terms of education, being imprisoned, violence, bulldozing of homes or businesses. I mean, all of those things are very much out there. And what India has done in Kashmir. So it is in many ways an overwhelming phenomena. It gets complicated by the fact that very often, as I said a little earlier, many countries don't speak out until they have to. And for many countries, they don't speak out because they benefit in their relationship with some of these countries.
Absolutely, and we'll get to that in our final question. But before we get to Asia and genocidal Islamophobia, I want to talk a little bit more about European Islamophobia. From Marine Le Pen in France to Geert Wilders in Holland, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and most recently Giorgia Meloni in Italy, we're seeing an entire new generation of right-wing ethno-nationalists across the EU who are using Muslims as political footballs today. You mentioned Poland. I'd written in my book that there was one analyst who said that in Poland, Muslims represent less than 1% of the population, but they're a part of 99% of Polish presidential elections now, right? Whether it's debating the French hijab ban or, Viktor Orban and others dehumanizing Muslim refugees as quote unquote economic migrants so that they don't have to provide legal protections for them and really treat them like human beings. It doesn't really look good for future generations of several million Muslims living all across Europe. And so with that, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on European Islamophobia today? Of course, understanding that it's a little bit different in every country, but do you think that it's trending in a positive or negative direction looking into the future?
I think it's a negative direction. I mean, if you look at France, there's been no significant change except that when the leader of France did not score as well as he could have, then there were speeches about this kind of inclusive speech. But the fact is, France, in what it was doing, it shut down the biggest, basically, Muslim civil rights, civil liberties organization. It had all kinds of regulations that were attempting to marginalize in terms of what people could wear or not wear. The UK, both political parties have been accused of Islamophobia. The Conservative Party more than Labour, but it exists, in both countries. Austria is stunning when you think of Austria as the place that's always seen as the international community where other countries would come to meet to solve problems, and it still goes on, with like having, let's say, Iran talks at times, in Vienna, and yet you look at what has happened in Austria in terms of the way in which Muslims, again, many Muslims who've been there for a number of generations, suddenly being treated and identified not as just simply and taken as it were fellow citizens, with regard to anybody else, or being identified primarily in terms of their ethnic background, but their religious background. I remember a number of years ago, I was invited to speak in Australia to the equivalent of their Foreign Relations Committee.
Okay. And
the chair of it was a woman who identified herself as someone who came as a young girl from Greece, and how everybody who was, quote, foreign at that time, come in, were identified by the country they came from. If they're coming from the Middle East, is Lebanese, etc. But how in recent years there's this distinction between talking about Muslims on the one hand and Australian Muslims and Australians. And it seems to me that the concern has to be even more in Italy today with the last elections. I mean, it was strong before that. And in the US, just look at the kind of conversations that exist in the country, not only in Trump's elections, but now as we're looking at legislative elections, across the country. Look at the language and the attitude towards Muslims and towards immigrants. And of course, a major portion of the way that Muslims are viewed is also as part of that large immigrant community. And there, what you see is, the overwhelming negative force occurs among many in the Republican Party, so much so that the old division between moderate and conservative, or very conservative, has almost disappeared. On many key votes, you're lucky if it's 3 so-called moderates that feel they can stand up and hope to be reelected when they have to vote on members of the Supreme Court, when they have to vote on legislation. But there are attempts to change that. But you see the strong opposition from the conservatives and the Republican Party with regard to the 3 members of Congress that are Muslim. And not only strong opposition, but the kind of language at times, referring to somebody, a fellow legislator, as a terrorist. So I think all of that is very much out there, and it's not really getting that much better. At the same time, there are Muslims that prosper in some of these countries. Just as if you look at the latest ISPU study, you have a significant number of Muslims that have prospered in the US, that are happy to be here, that want to be here. But many of them will talk about the fact that either members of their family or other fellow Muslims experience discrimination, sometimes 4 out of 10, 5 out of 10, and not particularly, but specifically, the whole question of bullying of young Muslims in school, a significant percentage. And the bullying percentage is also significant because they ask a second question, in terms of how often, and a significant number talk about their children being bullied on an almost a daily basis.
Yeah, it's becoming normalized in many parts of the world today, and we know, that when racism, bigotry, and xenophobia are all taken to their extremes, it can lead to truly genocidal outcomes. And we're starting to see that in several prominent Asian countries, including China, Myanmar, and India, as you mentioned, where Islamophobia is being weaponized to persecute Muslim minority populations. In China, we know that there are over 1 million Uyghur Muslims who are inside internment camps, forced to denounce their Islamic beliefs, eat pork and drink alcohol, which are forbidden to observant Muslims. They're sending in Han Chinese men from the mainland to sleep in the beds of Uyghur Muslim women, which is similar to obviously the ethnic cleansing campaigns of Slobodan Milosevic and during the Bosnian genocide in the mid-1990s. And in Myanmar next door, you mentioned that there has been a genocide where 1 million Rohingya Muslims have been ethnically cleansed out of their own country, and actually were even written out of their own country's laws. In 1981, Myanmar passed a citizenship law which recognized over 50 ethnic minority groups within Myanmar, excluding the Rohingya, even though they've lived there since time immemorial. Before I get to my final question in 5 Islamophobia questions with Professor John Esposito, the problem is, as you mentioned and you alluded to earlier, Dr. Esposito, is that sadly, in many cases, for example, China's case, they've essentially been able to buy the silence of prominent Muslim world leaders. I remember once a former Pakistani Prime Minister, Imran Khan, was being interviewed by a Turkish network, TV network, and they were asked, because of all the business you do with China, does that mean that you can't speak out on the Uyghur Muslims. And Imran Khan on camera said, to be honest with you, I don't really know what's going on there, even though the Xinjiang province of China actually shares a border with Pakistan. Even Turkey's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is a self-proclaimed Muslim populist leader, actually went against his own foreign ministry, who had condemned the Chinese government for their ethnic cleansing and genocide of 1 million Uyghurs, and actually told TV cameras that the Uyghurs were living happily in China. And so obviously that makes the job of those of us who are trying to advocate for Muslim human rights and combat Islamophobia all the more difficult. And so my final question to you, Dr. Esposito, is, based on all of this, why do you think that our viewers and people in general should care about global Islamophobia around the world today?
Well, because look, it's an enormous situation. B, the fact is, as you pointed out, that we're not getting enough people speaking out or doing anything about it. It's ironic that the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, whom there's much that I liked about him, one of the last things he did is to host a meeting of the OIC. And it was on, and his whole speech was on Islamophobia, but talking about the West. And his special guest was a senior Chinese government official who then was allowed to throw his words in. When you look now, you've got a globalization of Islamophobia that's occurring at the same time that anti-Semitism is occurring. Sure. And has increased. And an exponential increase also at the same time of ultra-conservative, right-wing, anti-immigrant, white nationalists, okay? Mm-hmm. Some of whom are ultra-Christian nationalists. And that phenomenon is spreading. It's not just in the United States. It exists in Europe. For those of us and for those in the international community and for those countries that like to see themselves as democracies, they need to take a look at the latest polls in the last couple of years and see where countries like the United States and others wind up scoring. It's not at all where your average American thinks we would score as in terms of how we're ranked as a democracy. It seems to me that there are many people in the world who want democracy, want equality, want freedom, want human rights. The question is, do they want them for all peoples and all peoples of color, all peoples in terms of their religion, etc. The globalization of Islamophobia constitutes a serious and substantial threat for the present and future of generations. So even in a country like the US or in some European countries where significant Muslims have accommodated themselves and are prospering, a significant number of Muslims have not and are marginalized and are discriminated against. And that doesn't bode well with regard to our future. And again, it dovetails with this growth. If you look at elections in so many of the countries, the Italian election is just the most recent, but again, France, Austria, you can go through the whole thing, let alone over to Asia. You look at the nature of those governments and what kind of educational system is going to be occurring. Well, you'll have, attempting to control the curriculum, to burn books, etc. What kind of media, significant media coverage, what kind of movies? Look at the latest thing about the way Muslims, mega movie stars, in Bollywood are being treated, in India. This is a phenomenon that at times people, I think, who are fortunate and are not victims, either don't have a clue about or just kind of feel, well, that's happening to them. There's probably a good reason for it, or at least it's not happening to me. And I don't think, we can count on it. When I was growing up, my wife and I often talk about this in post-World War, to America. We felt that we grew up in the best of possible times. Over time, the economy improved. Over time, certainly Italian Americans were no longer the villains in all the TV shows, etc. And we became integrated. We were able to go to colleges and universities and not really feel that we really should be going to simply our faith colleges and universities. And we saw the society is growing. We saw ourselves growing professionally, economically. You look now, and the divisions in our country today, and the divisions take place. If you travel in Europe and you go globally, you find the divisions take place within families themselves. And so I think that things are not going to get better; they're going to get worse unless there's a more concerted response by religious leaders, but also by political leaders. And sadly, there are problems there. There are problems among religious leaders in that you have ultra-conservative Catholics, Protestants. We can go through the range of people. Ultra-conservative evangelicals, certainly, but you can see it in a number of religious traditions when you start going globally. Where was the hero, of Myanmar? Where was she when all of this was going on in terms of speaking out or not speaking out? And when you don't have a Nobel laureate who steps up and speaks out, where are we? And I think in America, people are nervous about the next election and who, how our Congress may be dominated, and the kinds of policies that can come out of that, we already know affect social policy, political policy, but also it affects religious policy, how religion is either privileged or treated as if it's important for everybody, and that freedom of religion means freedom of religion for everybody, and not the idea that one's attitude on certain political or social policies is determined by somebody's religious outlook.
Professor John Esposito, I would like to thank you for joining me for episode 1 of Unpacking Islamophobia, but more importantly, as an American Muslim human rights lawyer who was born and raised in the United States, I want to thank you for being one of the greatest allies that the American Muslim community has ever had. 45 books. You have spoken out for tolerance and pluralism during times when nobody would speak out for us. And I want to acknowledge that on behalf of the 7 million American Muslims living here in the United States today. It is yeoman's work, and we hope that we will continue this work for decades more to come. So I wanted to publicly thank you for that. To our audience, I want to thank you for joining us for the Unpacking Islamophobia podcast. And for more information, please visit bridge.georgetown.edu. Thank you very much.